Fantastic.
Okay.
So pleased to be here with you guys. And for us, easements is a really important topic in real estate, because if there's one thing that's going to kill your deal or throw you a curveball, is on the listing side if you miss an easement or misrepresent an easement, or on the buying side if you miss an easement that drastically affects your client's intended use of land. That in a nutshell is why easements are so important. And as we know, obviously, I'll turn the volume up a little bit here. As we know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, this is an elite group of agents that I'm with today. I recognize that you recognize on a very, very deep and structural level that referrals are everything. That's why how you guys got through COVID so well. And referrals are based on damn good work with every single client, every single time. And so easements for us are one of those elements of information, tools, knowledge that can really help you deliver on your promise of looking after that client and making sure that their experience is as flawless as possible. So easements. So here's what we're going to go through today very briefly. It's going to take around 25 minutes, and we're going to talk about what an easement actually is. I'm going to just reroute you back into definition there. We're going to talk about different types of easements and different elements that exist within easements. We're going to talk about how we know if there's an easement on a property, and where they're documented, where easements are documented, where can you find out full information about easements. We're going to talk about, as we go through this, what tends to go wrong with easements. And then finally, we're going to talk very briefly about the Boundary Wise Academy, recognizing that we have at least 2 graduates with us today, which is phenomenal. Ed and Zan, thank you guys for joining us. And thank you for being part of the Academy, by the way. This 30 minutes, 25 minutes or so that we're going to do is a shortened version, an abbreviated version of what you would get on the Academy, which is far more in-depth, that you can take at your own pace. And then right at the end, we'll talk briefly about the Academy. So what is an easement? Let's talk about easements. So an easement is, fundamentally, an easement is the legal right to use a portion of someone else's property. And within that, what's important to understand that is that it's a non-possessory right, meaning that, Ed, if you and I live next to each other and I have an easement over a portion of your land, it means I have a legal right to use it, and you have a legal obligation to allow me to use it for the stated purpose. But it doesn't mean that I own that piece of land. You still own it. And therefore, when you sell that property, the easement gets transferred, the rights and obligations get transferred with that property. So your obligation to me, or to my property, transfers with it. Conversely, when I sell my property, the easement right goes to the new owner, because it stays with the property. So it's a non-possessory right. And if you think about it, it's really part of this bundle of rights that is title. If you've got a tenant in the basement, they have some of those rights of title that you have in your property. If you have a lender in play and a mortgage, they have part of your rights, your title rights. So too, if you have an easement against your property, the dominant tenement, the land to which the right accrues, the easement right accrues, has some of your rights of title. So think of it as part of your property, part of title, and if you have an easement against you, you're giving up part of that title, not in an ownership perspective, but in a legal right perspective to whoever has that easement against your property. Easements are granted by deed or by contract, and the majority of easements you're going to see are ones that are, you're going to see them in the deeds, old transfer documents and old deeds, and sometimes you'll see the really old meets and bounds descriptions, right?
Well, I don't know.
And
this is what it looks like. I don't know how big this one is, but.
Could we have, I think somebody's on, not on mute there. If we could, thank you, perfect, fantastic. Sorry, I have a real hard time listening and speaking at the same time. And also easements remain on title in perpetuity, except when they're granted for an explicit period. What does that mean? It means that an easement, if it's been granted last year or 200 years ago, 150 years ago, unless there's an explicit end date to it or an explicit event that's described that ends the easement, it stays on title in perpetuity. And one of the things that some inexperienced agents sometimes get into trouble with is when they do dig in and look at what the reason is for what the use of the easement is, it'll say something like it's an access easement for the purpose of moving livestock. Well, that was in effect 80, 90 years ago, right? It doesn't really have an impact anymore today. And so some people actually take legal action and say this easement is invalid because it's for livestock, and next door is using it to move their SUV to the back. Therefore, let's get rid of the easement. A court will always go towards the side of common sense and say that at that time it was livestock, now it's vehicles. The purpose of this is to be able to give the neighbor a legal right to move something large or a large quantity or something large from front to back because there isn't enough room between the property line and their house to do so. Therefore, an easement is in place. Please know that anytime a client says to you, I'm going to sue them or I'm going to get a lawyer or whatever else, that the court, when it gets to court, the court is always going to look at it from a perspective of common sense. What is the intent? And therefore, is the easement fulfilling that intent? And is the person who's challenging it challenging the base intent? Forget about the specific language, but are they challenging the intent? The other thing to note about remaining on title is that there is a difference, as we're going to see in a minute. There's a difference between an easement appearing in a legal description and whether or not it is still active. And those are two different things, which confuses the issue, because sometimes you'll look at a legal description and you'll see that there's an easement there and you'll go, well, there's an easement, only to find later on that that easement either expired or it's been deleted. Well, why is it still in the legal description? And the answer is, it's because it's up to humans, specifically lawyers and their clerks, to remove them, and they don't always do that. So sometimes they stay on legal descriptions even though they've been deleted. Please know that just because it's in the legal description doesn't mean that that overrides the fact that it was a deleted easement. So you really need to dig in. I guess the conclusion to that statement is that you really have to dig in and find out, is it still active? What is its nature? In order to be able to serve your client really well. So let's talk about some of the aspects, the general aspects of easements that are important to understand. Really, there are three: the parties, the ownership, and the nature of the easement. Parties to an easement. There are always two sides to an easement agreement. There is the dominant side and the servient side. The dominant side is comprised of one or more dominant tenements. A dominant tenement is the party to whom the right accrues. They gain the right that is expressed in the easement. The servient tenement, conversely, is the party that's giving up the right. Think of servient, servitude, giving up the right. And so you always have to have at least one dominant and one servient tenement. There always has to be one of each. Now you can have one servient and multiple dominants. So think of a property that has a laneway going across the back of it that allows the next three properties to access the road. So this is a servient tenement that's giving up a right over a strip of the land to their rear for three dominant tenements to be able to traverse over. Got it? That's one servient, multiple dominants. You can also have multiple servients with one dominant. Now that would be the property on the end. They would be the dominant over three other properties that they have to get across. So their easement would be one dominant, multiple servients. That would be an example of a multiple servients, one dominant. So you can have one or many of each, but you have to have at least one of each. Otherwise, it's an imbalanced easement. You can't have a right being gained without it being given up. It's a zero-sum game. So that's the first thing. The second thing is ownership. The vast majority of easements that you're going to come across that are going to cause you issues are called appurtenant easements. An appurtenant easement basically means that the rights and obligation are connected to, they run with the land. So if I say that, Marietta, you and I live next to each other and I have an easement over your property, that's actually a misnomer. I don't have the easement. My property has an easement over your property. It is an appurtenant easement that runs with the land. Nobody cares. The land doesn't care who owns the property. The easement is part of title of that property, and therefore whoever owns it is obliged to adhere to the rights and obligations of that easement. So appurtenant easements run with the land, and the vast majority of appurtenant easements look like mutual driveways, shared driveways, laneways, access routes, all those different kinds of rights of way that are given, that are gained and given in residential real estate. And especially when we're looking at a densely populated residential area like the GTA, specifically Toronto, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these easements that have been put in place to help property owners enjoy their land fully. The other classification of easements, maybe classification is a better term than ownership, is easements in gross, or gross easements. Easements in gross, they don't run with the land. The right accrues to either an individual, which is very rare, or a corporation. And the most common examples of these are utility easements, telco easements. So when Rogers has an easement over your property, or the local hydro company has an easement over your property, or the TTC has an easement under your property because you're on your property sits over the subway line, it would not make sense for that easement, the right of that easement, to accrue to a piece of Rogers land, would it? Because it's not the land that needs access. It's the Rogers crews that need access to be able to maintain their assets. So the right accrues to a corporation. And so this is called an easement in gross, a gross easement. A pertinent easement run with the land, gross easements run, the right runs with, accrues to a corporation. Sometimes an individual, that's very rare. But I actually haven't seen one that runs where the easement is in favor of an individual. I've seen them all as easements in gross, as running with corporations. The last classification is deals with the nature of an easement. There's affirmative and negative, and the vast majority, again, of easements that you're going to see out there are affirmative easements. They give a property or a corporation a right that they otherwise wouldn't have. So again, laneways, right-of-ways, easements, gross easements, most of them are affirmative easements. I get to do something that I wasn't able to do otherwise. Negative easements, on the other hand, prevent a property or the owners of a property from doing something. And really the most common example of negative easements that you're going to see out there is to do with air rights. Think of every single airport in the area. You've got Billy Bishop, you've got Downsview, you've got Pearson, you've got Buttonville. I thought Buttonville was meant to be shut down. It's still open, isn't it? Buttonville. And you also have every single hospital that has a helipad on its roof, and major building that has a helipad on its roof. Every single one of those has flight paths that come in to their various runways. And each one of those flight paths has a conically shaped easement around it, particularly on the bottom underneath. And that is intended, and that easement basically sits on top of every single property underneath it for the purpose of preventing people from developing up into the flight path. Makes sense, right? That's a negative easement. It stops the developers below building up into the flight path, which would be dangerous. A more acute version that we've seen a few of are right to light easements. And you'll only see these occasionally in some really old parts of Toronto. And what's interesting about them is that, remember at the beginning we said they stay on, an easement stays on title in perpetuity. You will find some of these that were put in place in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where basically it says, this property here, whoever owns it, cannot build it up higher than 1 story, because to do so would block the light to the neighboring property. So this property here, the neighboring property, has a negative easement over the property next door that ensures light always comes through to the yard. An interesting, quaint, very rare, but nonetheless relevant easement. And obviously the most common ones are right-of-way and easements in gross. There's one small thing I want to add to this, if I may, at this point, and that's the context. And for me, it's the context that finally made the easement penny drop. There's so much information, I know, and sometimes you feel like you're struggling to find the end of the ball of string, right? As you're trying to figure out, how do I understand this? For me, my understanding came when I realized the following, and that is that easements represent the exception to the boundary rule, the exception to boundary law. Boundary law essentially says, you live next to me, we have a property boundary between us. I own everything up to that property boundary on my side, and you own everything up to the property boundary on your side. And it is this imaginary plane. It's not a line, it's a plane. And everything up to that is mine, everything on the other side up to it is yours. there are, and technically speaking, if I step through that plane onto your property, technically speaking, I'm trespassing, and that's illegal. So there are so many situations, and that's a pretty rigid law. And there are many situations, as we know, when we need a little bit of flexibility there without having to purchase the land every single time. That would be a nightmare. And so this concept of easements was created as the legal instrument that allows us, that gives us that wiggle room, that ability to be able to use a portion of somebody else's land legally without having to own it. That's what, fundamentally, that's what an easement is. It's the legal instrument that gives flexibility, that gives us the flexibility in the very strict and rigid boundary law. If you can remember that and root yourself in that, everything else flows really easily from that after that. So when we look at the different types of easement in that context, when we look at the different types of easement, a right-of-way, a utility easement, a support easement. Think of when condos get built and they start digging down, right? First they dig down to get the footings and the foundations. And when they dig down a few feet, fine. They dig down 10 feet. Now they need to shore up the sides with shoring, right? And as they dig down further, they have to hold that shoring up, otherwise it's going to cave in. There's no good shoring it up on the inside because then you can't dig further. That's going to be a disaster. So they shore it up by putting support easements through and connecting it either to the foundation of the property next door, of the building next door, or to the rock over the boundary next door. Well, you need an easement for each one of those. You can't just do it. It's trespass, right? And so for each one of those support easements, for those supports, you have to have an easement. When condos are being constructed, an enormous amount of work goes into the hundreds and hundreds of easements that have to be put in place for the construction period. Afterwards, you've got maintenance and repair easements that get put in place. And you see this a lot in in townhouse complexes. Easements described in condominium declarations. Condos have a ton of easements, as you know, that govern how people can get from their condo that they own through common elements portions, which are usually, and easements to get to the various portions outside to the various facilities within. Construction easements we've talked about, conservation easements. Guys, if you have a client who backs onto conservation land, I know you know this, I'm just going to say it though because I have to. Please, please, please do not take that lightly. Conservation authorities are incredibly strict and inflexible when it comes to people doing things that they want to do on the land. They don't care if you just spent $500,000 doing something at the back of your property. If it encroaches by a foot onto the land that they feel they have purview over, then you are going to be in trouble. It doesn't just mean easements though. If you're backing onto conservation area, don't just look at the boundary and say there's no easement. You've got to look into their floodplains and other management areas to make sure that you're okay. That goes off the easement path a little bit. Right to light we talked about, time limited access we talked about, air rights we've talked about. Basically, all of these come under the one umbrella of easements, and easements are the exception to the boundary rule. So how do we know if our property has an easement? Well, you go to the legal description. And in the legal description, reading from left to right, the first portion of the legal description is always the locational component. It's telling you what lot and what plan this property is. In this particular place, you look at I've got at the top of a parcel register here, part of lot 22, plan 878, Township of York, as described in CA 294772, that's the transfer, comma. So what you're looking for when you're looking for easements, you're looking for ST and or TW. Those are the indicators. That's what indicates easements in a legal description. So in this case, this one says ST and TW CA 294772. ST stands for subject to. It's convenient because it's also the same letters that we would use for servient tenement. So you know that ST, servient tenement subject to, means that this property is the servient tenement in an easement agreement. In plain English, this property has an easement against it. There's another piece of land or a corporation that has some sort of legal right to use a portion of this property. Conversely, TW means that it is the dominant tenement in an easement agreement. this property has a legal right to use a portion of someone else's land. When you see ST and TW, the way we see it right here, followed by one code afterwards, what that means is 99% of the time, it means it's a mutual driveway. It means that either side of the boundary, there's a certain amount of land that has been marked off as the easement, and they each have access over the other's piece, and they each have to give access to the other over their piece. They're swapping rights over strips of land either side of the boundary for the purpose of creating a mutual driveway. Please remember, the number one rule of easements is that you cannot block or obstruct an easement for any reason, which means this is where it comes home for you as realtors on both the listing side and the buying side. If you determine that there is a mutual driveway, and you've gone through the process I'm going to show you in a minute of determining where on the ground the footprint of the easement actually is relative to the buildings, and you see it, you know that that needs to be kept free and clear at all times in order to actually be legal. Because when your client moves in, or if you're listing and you're selling, when the buyer moves in, they have every right to say to the next door neighbor, get all your crap, all your stuff off the easement. And there's nothing the neighbor can do to stop that from happening. I guess they can just refuse to do it, in which case the new owner has to get a little maybe litigious, I don't know. But if you look at the easement that you know the footprint of, and you see that there's an RV park there, or a boat park there, or a shed's being built, or something like that, then that is a red flag for you to at least have the conversation. If you're on the listing side with the seller, if you're on the buying side with the listing agent, say, there's an easement here that this property has rights over, and yet the next door neighbor has a boat on there. What gives? Is it always there? Is it sometimes there? You might find that your client doesn't want to buy into the kind of dispute that might ensue with their new neighbors if they moved in there. So the other thing to note here is that after what you see where it says STNTW CA294772, that CA294772 is a unique code that is, it's called the instrument number. Instruments are legal documents that describe the easement in detail. So if we were reading this portion in plain English, it would say this property is subject to and is also, so it's the servient tenement and the dominant tenement in a mutual driveway that's described in detail in legal document CA294772. Sorry guys, one sec, I just have to cough. Apologies. So CA294772 is the legal document that that further describes that easement. And so when we look at where do we find out where the easements are documented, from a registry perspective, you're going to see easements on the property deed, but you're also going to see them on the parcel register. And the parcel register is an incredibly important document. If you're not familiar with them, join the academy. We will acquaint you with them and their importance and how you use them in your real estate deals. There's one more here that isn't on this list, and that is our website, Protect Your Boundaries. We need to update this screen, because what we've done over the last few years is we've run scripts on every single legal description, on the legal description of every single property in Ontario. And we have gone through to identify every instance of an ST or a TW or any variation thereof. And so we have a pretty good idea of how many easements are on every single property. The second you need to know if there's an easement on a property, come to protectyourboundaries.ca, type in the address, and the very first thing we'll show you on the page is how many easements are on that property. That at least gives you sort of the green light, red light, either there is or there aren't. From there, you can go further. You can get the property deed yourself if you want. You can get the parcel register yourself if you want and interpret it. You can look at the legal description and see how many are there. Are we the servient tenement or are we the dominant tenement? But most importantly, what you're looking to find out is what is the nature of the impact of this easement on the property. And the survey plan is where that really comes into play beautifully, because the survey plan, parcel register right here. The survey plan, we've zoomed into the survey plan here. Here's the problem with a written description of the easement. It tells you in great detail in medieval English sometimes how you determine the exact footprint of these easements. And I got to tell you, I've been doing these for 6 years now. And every time one comes across my desk as an easement report, I look at it and I just think, oh my goodness, I need a stiff drink before I start this. Because it really is written in, some of them are written in Old English, and it's just, yeah, they're very, very difficult to determine where the starting point is. They talk about bearings and they talk about distances and all the rest of it. It's not easy. A survey plan shows you the easement on the ground relative to the boundary, and more importantly, relative to the buildings that it, in this case, that it is between. So here's a survey of number 261. The front is to the left, the back is to the right. And you'll see that the thick dark line is the boundary. I think you should be able to see my mouse. There is the boundary right there. And you'll see that in orange there is an easement. It says right there, right of way, and it's got this arrow that goes from one side of this, wide dashed line, long dashed line. You'll see it creates a rectangle like this. And it tells us right here that the easement is 6.66 feet wide and 75 feet long. And here it tells you, here at the back, it tells you that either side of the easement, both sides are 3.33 feet. So it's equidistant. Both sides are giving up exactly the same amount of space for this easement. What's interesting is that on this side, the boundary is 3.33 feet from the building, which means that the easement goes right up against the foundation here. There's not even an inch of space. On the other side, the easement is 3.52, the building is 3.52, which means there are a few inches, there's a few inches of space there. Now, in this case, you're talking about maybe 2 or 3 inches, big deal. For your purpose, it means that this easement goes right up against both buildings, which means that if your client is looking to purchase 261, and you look down this, what's supposed to be a mutual driveway, and you see that the next door neighbor has parked their cars over the boundary, parked an RV back here, parked a boat down here, or somebody's built a fence right into the easement like they've done here. You can see the fence has been built into the easement. What you're looking at is the chance that your client will end up in a situation where they can't use their land the way they anticipated, and they may end up in an immediate fight with their neighbor. But more importantly, B, you're looking at an opportunity to say to your client, I know you love this home. I can see it through a lens that you can't, and let me tell you what I see so you can make an even more better informed decision. And you can explain to them exactly what you see and what the implication is to them. They'll probably still buy it, but boy, the value you've added by being able to explain this to them is huge. So survey plan is the best way to see the footprint of an easement on the ground. So a lot of copy on this. It's a very simple slide though. What we usually find in real estate is that easements get missed and clients get shafted for 2 different reasons. First of all, either the buyer and seller, the buyer and or seller are just unaware. The seller did not know there was an easement. The listing agent didn't ask, didn't look, said, oh, that's the lawyer's work to do. It's not for me. I'm just here to do staging, right? And don't get me started. I know I can say that to you guys. On the buying side, the buyer's like, oh, great, the client wants it. Let me do the paperwork. I've got a discount deal going here. I'm not going to do any work. I'll do the paperwork away it goes. Anything that happens, that's up to them to figure out. Again, don't get me started. The seller, the second though, is a little more insidious. And I think this is the one that you probably have your spidey senses on all the time for. And that is that when you're on the listing side and you've won the listing, and the seller is, the seller is hiding something. The seller is trying to convince you that something that you have a pretty strong suspicion of as being an issue that you need to at least look into whether or not to disclose. They're trying to convince you otherwise. And easements are one of those things that happens with all the time, because if a property has an easement against it, if a property is the servient tenement in an easement, it does affect the use of land. It reduces the footprint. If it's a tear down, it reduces the size of the building footprint that can be applied for. If it's about parking, well, all of a sudden you can't park your car between the two houses. You've got to park in the back. Well, maybe you want to do something in the back. And so oftentimes what we find is sellers, I'm sure you find it too, try to downplay the easement or hide it, which is why it's so important on the listing side, as I know you know, is don't believe a word they say. Do your own research, figure it out yourselves, because at the end of the day, it's your reputation, your career on the line here. And that's what really matters in all of this. And what goes wrong when an easement gets missed is that it gives the buyer an opportunity to renegotiate the deal between the APS getting signed and closing, to renegotiate the deal, reduce the price. And we had an example a couple of months ago when somebody got to knock $15,000 off at the last minute before closing because an easement was revealed that hadn't been revealed in the listing. An easement was revealed that reduced the footprint of the land by a very small amount, but it was enough to allow for a reduction in price. Worse, it gives the buyer an opportunity, or at least if the buyer's got a good lawyer, the opportunity to get out of the deal. We saw this happen a lot in 2017, where people ended up getting into bidding frenzies way above what their lenders, damn it, so embarrassing, so sorry. Lenders bidding way above what lenders were able to, were willing to give, and winning the deal, signing the APS, and then realizing that they didn't have the financing. Easements were the number one way in which sellers were able to, buyers with great lawyers were able to get out of deals because sellers hadn't disclosed easements. The other is that they have to keep the driveway clear. They can't park in the driveway. They can't build a pool or the patio or the deck that they wanted in the back. Again, another situation that we had where somebody was just about to sign a deal. And their agent at the last minute said, I need to look into easements. And they called us and we found that there was a 4-foot easement, hydro easement that went right across the rear of the property. They wanted to buy this property to put a pool in. Not going to happen. The buyer can't use the land as originally anticipated. And so what ends up happening is that you do get sued. You do get chased. You do end up in title insurance claims. You end up with dissatisfied buyers and sellers, and it isn't nice because you end up having to put out these wildfires online of bad press, bad reviews, and all the rest of it. And we know this is a review economy. You need the reviews, and you need everything you possibly can get to A, get the listing, but also to make sure you get the next listing from that client as well. Again, I'm preaching to the converted guys. I think I've gone over time here. If you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask. Zoom is great for that. We often do these on YouTube, but it's not as easy. But if you have any questions, please ask, and then we can just do a couple of slides on the Boundary Wise Academy.
Yeah, I do actually, Chris. One thing is, I want to say that I did buy your course, okay? And it was, I think it was $300, and I can't tell you how impressed I was. I'll tell you why. Is that immediately after that, I went on a listing presentation, but I purchased the parcel register and the instrument, the impact. I sat down with the client. I showed them the register. I showed them what their mortgage was. They didn't even know what it was, the approximate amount. I showed them the square footage on their house. It was incredible. There was 2 other agents they called in and just blew them out of the water. They said they'd never seen anything done so well as I had done so much research. Yes, I spent $40 or something like that to do this, but I'm talking about a $15,000 commission, so I didn't mind spending the money. So I recommend it highly. And something else I wanted to mention was when I started in real estate, it was 1980, and I listed my first listing at Greenwood and Dundas, I think it was. And the property had like 4 or 5 easements on top of the back of the property because they were all laneways at the back. And the thing was, I didn't have a survey, but I had a surveyor's notes. And I just finished doing a school at Georgetown College, which used to be called Provincial Institute of Trades. And I actually did the drawings of the survey and attached it to the listing, and it was actually accepted. So interesting. Thank you.
Wow, very good. Yeah, thank you, Ed. I'm glad you got through it, and I'm glad that it was a positive experience for you.
Yeah. I wonder, I'd like to add that it goes beyond the course. I think I was one of the early adopters on the course with Chris way back at the prime part of COVID. But since then, I've had the occasion to take advantage of calling Chris for his expertise and help, which has been phenomenal. Both of them, if I recall, were sort of potential boundary disputes. And it was great to have that, even though I was able to delve in and find information based on what I'd learned in the course and prior skills, it was confirmation, and it's really worth its weight in gold to have Chris and his team at our backs. So thank you.
Thank you, Zahn. And for me, I think I was desperate for company. So thank you for calling me.
Okay, can I ask a question now too? I noticed
Yes, of course, Ed.
on it said on the survey that you showed, and let's say it's a right of way or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know what CA 294772 means?
Well, you don't. That's the interesting conundrum in all of this. CA 294772 is the identifier, the alphanumerical identifier of the legal instrument that describes the easement, and that could be, and that could be, it could be a deed, it could be a transfer document, it could be a reference plan, it could be a survey plan, it could be anything. Now, in this case, there's another little clue here. You'll see that in the first part of the legal description, if I go back a couple here, hang on a second. Let me go back to this one. Here it is. Here's a close-up of it. Yes. You'll see that the locational component of the legal description says that this is part of Lot 22 on Plan 878, as in CA 294772. Well, we know that that is always going to be the deed. Then it goes on to say this property is subject to and together with easements described in that same document, CA 294772. So in this case, you do know that it's the deed. I don't expect anyone on your side of things to remember this particular nuance, but typically you do not know what is behind that document, which is why you either have to go and get the instruments yourself or pick up one of our easement reports on the Boundary Wise Academy or Protect Your Boundaries. Buyer's report, seller's report, easement report. We basically do a full title search for you and present that information in plain English. So it's a bit of a mystery until we get the documents.
If there's any other questions, actually I've done all the questions, me and Zan. No, I think people are logging out now, so I think we're okay. Chris, perfect. I'm going to put this, and Jessica, I'm going to put this on edsclubs.com. The whole video has been recorded.
Fantastic.
And I'm also going to send it out to all the agents that couldn't attend. I did have agents say, are you going to video this? Because they had appointments they had to keep. So I will put it online for them, and I'll let everybody know that it's there. Thank you so much for coming online. I really enjoyed it. I see.
Thank you, Ed.
It's just coming in, but a little bit late. Okay, so I think I'll end it for all now. Okay, so goodbye to everybody.
Fantastic.
Thanks for dropping in, and thanks so much again, Chris.
Thank you, Ed. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.